Hello and welcome back to JLXP, the long-awaited episode with Emily Rand. Not really that long. I asked her like a week ago, and now she's made it. But this is it's very similar to the episodes that I would do back in 2020 with Keen, back when he was writing the 10 Thoughts series. I think it's a great jumping off point to a good conversation. So the 10 Thoughts article, if you don't know, comes out on LOL Esports basically every Thursday. It's been written by Emily for how long now? Almost a year?
Yeah, a little over a year because Keen went to work on his now not so secret project, which was writing for players. So he said that publicly, so I can say
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. That's going to be the newish CBS show mockumentary about League of Legends that I'm actually really excited for as well. But I'm not going to talk about that yet either. It's something I'm looking forward to. But there's so much interesting stuff in week 3. My suggestion for the viewers, if you're here right now, if you want to get like maximum out of this episode, pause, go read the 10 Thoughts article. It's usually a pretty quick and fun read. And then we'll dive into some of the other discussions. And we're going to go in order of the teams. Also, if you came here for the TSM discussion, that's going to be at the end of the video because they were at the end of the 10 Thoughts because they are in last place. So they don't get to be first in the video. But just like in the article. Anyway, Emily, you started off talking about 100 Thieves.
hmm
Let's do that. Was there anything that you want to dive in deeper on, or something that you couldn't quite fit into 10 Thoughts, and we'll talk about them.
So something I've been tracking that I thought was really interesting about them going into this season that I've tried to create kind of a through line in 10 Thoughts, or at least keep rehitting, is the fact that I actually thought of all teams, 100 Thieves were uniquely qualified to start well
Mm.
because they had already practiced a lot of pushing bot lanes at Worlds,
Mm-hmm.
looked pretty comfortable with them, even with some mistakes they made in maybe not being proactive as much in some of their games, that I thought they could have won. But in general, they already knew how to front to back team fight with like a strong bot lane. They'd experimented with bot lane, various bot lanes before in LCS, and then
Mm-hmm.
they'd also done these pushing like Lucian Nami lanes at Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I saw the TP changes and the um what bot lanes were becoming really, really strong
Yep.
in, China and South Korea, I was like, okay, well, 100 Thieves, they're going to be a team that really understands how to play it. But the only glimpses we saw of that were in lock-in tournament, and I
Mm-hmm.
think some of them were executed really well. I think I believe it was Dignitas going up against them did a really good job of like countering that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then they've gone back to like a front to back team fighting style, which I thought was interesting to call out. It was also cool to see them get their hands on the Senna again, because I think they are a team that is uniquely prepared to use Senna in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also been tracking Huhi on engaged supports versus mage supports.
And I think Hui's someone who's good at mage supports, but especially for players that kind of run the map a little bit like Hui does, I think it's just so important for them to play on engaged supports. Something that there's a couple things that piqued my interest reading the 100 Thieves part. One is the engaged supports because I think it's similar to Core JJ. And weirdly enough, during one of the off seasons when Core JJ was doing all those in-houses and he was like recruiting his own teams, I like coached the team against Core JJ, which is like not really coaching. It was like helping with draft and asking them what they played and then listening to their comms. But Huhi was the support on the other team, and I felt like his comms were just so strong in the way that
Mm.
he leads the team around what he wants to do next. We ended up winning the set like 3-1 or something, but his Pantheon game in particular was just like so clear of what he wanted to do. So it makes total sense that even if he's good at range supports and they can win lane, just running the map on something that has authority is not really something that can be replaced or easily ported to another player. So like it might not even be a weakness for him. It's just if the champion can't do it, you can't port that skill to someone else.
hmm
And then the other thing that I liked was the Lee Sin play, because And here's another like backstory. I remember like when this happened, and I honestly feel like it was because AD carries wanted to play Lee Sin. Like that's the whole reason it was good. During that week leading up to when he played it in LCS, Tactical played it a bunch in scrims as well because they actually beat us with it in scrims, and he was like, "It's so broken, like we have to do it." And he was a really good Lee Sin in scrims, but it just didn't port to stage. Anything else you wanted to touch on with 100 Thieves?
That's hilarious. No, I'm just glad I found that out about Tactical. At that time, Lee Sin was like broken, so it's totally fine.
Yeah.
We should have seen it. I'm sad now.
I think the similar thing happens when like Vayne is good. Everyone just needs an excuse to play the fun champion. Like, Ruler plays it. And then next week, like 10 LCS AD carries are suddenly Vayne lanes. Okay, Cloud9. General consensus following their first loss was that it could instill confidence, not less. Go into a little bit of depth about that?
Yeah, so this was something that Mark and I touched upon when we were on Hotline League. Is something that I think a general sentiment in the community was that not only was it the draft in that game and how they were willing to experiment with a slightly different play style that also made the most of the fact that Fudge is going to know how to play things, that swap easily from top to mid, like the Aurelia. And they nearly won that game despite a lot of mistakes, and also Blabber just not looking very comfortable on the Karthus past the initial farming stage. So I also came out of that thinking, okay, like this team, there's a lot more depth to what they're doing. And not that I didn't think they had depth previously, but until it's shown to you, you're not necessarily going to make that assumption. So
I agree.
They've been trying out a lot of different champions, and that loss was when I was definitely like, okay, this is a top LCS team. Yeah. What they're doing is quite interesting.
I like the stat of 19 unique champions in 20 possible champion slots across their 4 games. That's a lot. Like, especially with the way you generally can achieve short-term victories is through shrinking your champion pool so you're comfortable. Question actually, and this is like a far out take. I wonder if we'll ever see Malice in LCS Spring Split. Because they talk about the like meritocracy they have, or that they want to have, about who's playing better in scrims, and like and this is a very random tangent. I was watching Malice's stream, and there was this one Champions Queue game where his Karthus was just absolutely disgusting. Like, beyond anything I'd seen him do on Karthus before. In the, like, Champions Queue game, he was, like, 12 CS per minute. I think he ended the game, I think he ended the game 15-0 with a 25-stack Medjais and a death cap, and did, like, 5x the damage of everybody else in the game. Just absolutely absurd. And it's a stretch, but it was just a thought that kind of crossed my mind of, if they really do want to play his like quirky champion pool and they have a good standing already, like just throw him in there. Do you think that's something that we might have a chance of seeing?
I'm going to say no for the time being, only because, and this kind of touches on something we're going to talk about a lot more in depth later, but when you're trying to develop a roster, since this roster didn't get a lot of synergy together, I would definitely want, and especially since they've been successful, I would want to keep them together as a unit as much as possible. Yeah. Putting aside the whole, like, I do know, I watched the video about the meritocracy thing, and we were kind of talking about it with Sven as well, considering how well he played during the lock-in tournament. And obviously Berserker has come in and been
phenomenal. And then I just see Berserker be this like amazing AD carry.
It makes me so happy because I know I've said this so many times on broadcast, I watched him previously on a not great team. Yeah. So I'm happy that he is able to just absolutely come in, pop off. But yeah, I would definitely keep the 5-man unit together. I also think, as I say in this paragraph, some of the stuff that Malice plays, in particular the Hecarim, which we've also seen in
Mm-hmm.
LPL a lot, could be something that Blabber would like easily pick up
Yeah.
because he's played it with a ton of success previously, and it's
Yeah.
like very much in his wheelhouse as well.
That's going to be, that's going to be something I want to track as well. Is not only which Malice picks does Blabber play, but then does Malice play any meta or Blabber picks in Academy? Because I know C9A is really the must watch of Academy as well. When you look at those streams, they end up getting like 8 and 10,000 viewers because they just want to see it. But already we've seen like Udyr from Blabber
Yep.
and Karthus from Blabber. So right now it seems that it's just the Malice picks porting to Blabber, but I don't know if it'll be the other way around. That's just like a fun little thing. We can move on to Dignitas, who we have at 3-1. And yeah, we were talking about this earlier, and I realized in my notes I haven't looked it up, and I'm wondering if you have. What is it about early season Dignitas that makes them good? Let's look at the past couple years. I want to look at the past couple years, but I'm wondering if you've done that already.
I haven't. I think I will say this. I have more confidence in this Dignitas roster to sustain themselves towards the top. I think eventually they'll be kind of outpaced by like Team Liquid, C9, like the teams that we kind of expect to be there at the top. But I don't think they're going to get so massively outpaced that suddenly they're going to have this like incredible streak of losses either. And comparing them to like last year's Dignitas team, right? Where it was
Who
like
started 6-3 and then fell off in summer.
Really weird, unique picks from Dardoch week after week. And then really not great neutral setups and some not great laning into phenomenal team fights. Like that team, for whatever reason, and I talked to them about it several times, and they could never say exactly how they worked together so well in team fights. But it was just like they would just like press their buttons, and all of a sudden the team would be communicating well through like fighting, and that is how they won some of those games. So I think this Dignitas team, when I look at the fundamentals of the game, is a lot stronger in that regard, which means I do think it will be more difficult for teams to outpace them. I can still see where they would outpace them based on their strengths and weaknesses of the team right now. However, I don't think it's as, I mean, I don't want to say gimmicky, but like I don't think it's as like circumstantial as it was, at least with last year's Dignitas.
Yeah. What's interesting to me about last year's Dignitas, comparing them to this year's Dignitas, even though they're largely different teams, aside from like Fake God in the top lane and Neo was 80 carry, everything else has changed. Like Dardoch was so key in their stage wins because he'd either bring out this weird champion pick or this like creative, quirky early jungle path that would net a big early game advantage. And then when people talk about River, they also say he probably ganks more than any other jungler in the LCS, but it almost feels like the structure with which they play the early game, and then more so the structure with which they play the mid and late game. Like the second one is what I think is different with this Dignitas team, but the early game is remarkably similar in terms of like how the jungler almost over ganks or does something creative to give them an advantage.
Yeah, I think River is a lot more focused on the lanes to the detriment of himself, where Dardoch wasn't nearly as much. So that would be the counterpoint, I would say,
Fair.
in that regard.
Yeah.
But I definitely think that this team overall, just based on their jungle to lane communication, just seems to have much a better understanding of just the actual fundamentals of the game and like how to do some of these things. So even if they are not necessarily having like a perfect setup around the neutral objective, they're able to like fix it and take it in the moment, or they're able to react, or they're able to like there was this team fight that Braz pointed out or several actually successive team fights where Dignitas were collapsed really well on some bad Drake setups from CLG that were smart. So I do think there is a little bit more thought in their setups that is better for a longer term, sustaining yourself for a long term, especially when the LCS is like so wide open right now.
Yeah, with the 5 teams that are at 3-1. I did the digging just now about early season Dignitas. It is true, but it's only true in spring.
Okay.
They're really, really bad in the last 2 years in summer. So they were 6-3 to start spring 2020, but then they were something like 2-7 to start summer. We just didn't notice because this records carried over. So even if they're really bad, they like showed up as 15-15 or something.
Yeah.
And then spring of 2020, they were still pretty good relative to expectations. I believe they were 5-4, but they started summer like 0-8. So it's definitely been an early season, in like early year run into summer being a disaster. They're probably hoping to break that curse. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Biofrost, actually. So far, I'm not 100% bought in, and I didn't say this earlier on the year because it's like kind of worthless to like pile on or be mean. I kind of thought he was washed. Like I just thought he was going to come in and they were signing him for like maybe the brand or the experience or something. But he's come in, like played to his strengths and actually looked really good. And I wanted to like, even though I didn't make the statement, I wanted to say I was wrong about that at first. So he's impressed me so far, which is nice.
Shout out to Biofrost.
Yeah. FlyQuest, 3-1. But I think they probably have the biggest like 3-1 like asterisks because of their strength of schedule, which I want to pull it up one more time just so I don't get it wrong. It was the easiest strength of schedule in the league until they played against TL, which is when they lost. It was TL, obviously, and then they played against TSM, which was like the biggest stomp, and we'll get to TSM at the end of the video. They beat Golden Guardians in a close game, and then their first game was CLG. So they played against 0-4, 0-4, at the time 0-1, but I think Golden Guardians is like a sleeper good team, and then they lost to TL. So what are your expanded thoughts on FlyQuest?
So I'll say in going standard against TSM, I was like, okay, the fact that game was so not close at all, despite the fact that TSM are kind of a dumpster fire right now that we're going to talk about later, that actually really stood out to me just because TSM have good players, right? Like the problem, in my opinion, is not that TSM don't have talent on their roster. And one thing that we were kind of talking about with FlyQuest is like, is this strategy something that they're using to cover up what they think might be like laning weaknesses, right? However, against TSM, they capitalized on TSM mistakes and just kind of like rolled over them. And I thought, even though, yes, it's against one of the worst teams in the league, that spoke really well to, again, FlyQuest's coordination as a team. I still think we're going to see a dip in their results because I do think it's going to be difficult for them to stand up to the better teams in the LCS. However, as someone who really was down on them going into the split based on their lock-in performance, they've performed a lot better than I expected, even with like the caveat that they misexecuted the Smite Top strategy, especially in their game against Golden Guardians, I would say.
Yeah, I'm really, really interested in watching them play against Dig, which is the second game of the week. It's the first game for both of them because the winner of that will like temporarily be at 4-1. But it's also going to be extremely testing for FlyQuest because I can also see a world like they're 3-1 now, but to close out the first round robin, it goes Dignitas, 100 Theives. And then for those of you who don't know, week 4 is like a super week. So there's 3 games and we'll be at our halfway point. They then play EG, Immortals, who's not the worst, and C9. So like if you're just going by who's the favorite and you say Dignitas would be stronger and you think Immortals is worse, that would be like 4 and 5. There's a very bad scenario where they go on a like what would end up being a 6-game losing streak if they lose all 5 of those. So just hugely testing once they start playing the better teams for them. So I really can't make a conclusion about this team whatsoever. I did want to add to your laning versus team fighting point though. The team is very coordinated, and I don't want to fault them for that, because I think there's a general conception sometimes that if you have the like raw ingredient, which is strong laning, then like, oh yeah, you'll just add the coordination in team fighting. Like it doesn't work like that. Like they're both really hard muscles to build. So it's, props to them for having the coordination so far.
Agree.
Team Liquid. I think we're seeing Core JJ, right?
Yes.
Right. Green card tweet from Dodo that you mentioned. Core still hasn't said anything. I feel like I want to see a bigger announcement. I'm so happy for him to be back. I'll do my Core JJ like gush session after, but I think it's important we talk about Ayla first, who you mentioned.
Yeah, so like I remember going back to last year and talking about when Jenkins came in for Alfari, and we were looking at the stats for Jenkins, and we were like, if we didn't have to compare him to Alfari's spring performance, we would just be saying like this guy is a straight up good top laner. Like he's performing really, really well in the TL system. Like obviously you can feel how you want about Jenkins thus far because CLG have had a rocky start. But I think he's just a better player than people gave him credit for. And I also think that the TL staff did a good job of setting him up for success. And we see this in Ayla as well. Like I think Ayla was someone that I didn't really know how well he would perform on TL, especially substituting in for someone that, like, it's really hard to describe how famous Core JJ is as an LCS player outside of the LCS. Like, I remember talking to, you talk to like even players in other regions and they'll talk about how good Core is like as a player. The reason why this roster is this like super team lineup is even together is because Core JJ is on it and people just want to play with him that much. So when you are comparing yourself to that, obviously it's a very high bar. So, like in that regard, in only that regard, Ayla is not set up for success. But the team did such a good job of just making sure he was on picks that he was really comfortable with, which is something I previously credited TL for when Bradley came in as well for that one game. And he performed really well. Like not just like, oh, this is a stopgap, like we're limping along, like dragging his carcass. Like, no, that's not at all what happened. So it was an amazing showing for him. I hope that it gets more eyes on him as a player because I think he performed very admirably in what was or what could have been a really, really tough situation if TL hadn't performed well.
I agree. And it's a matter of framing. So if we framed this as let's just say, because this is not a reality anymore, but it was probably something that was in play. Like, oh, Core JJ is retiring from pro play temporarily because he has to do his 2 years of mandatory Korean military service, which the green card is allowing him to continue to play in the LCS. But let's just say like 6 months ago, that was announced. And it's like, okay, TL is starting their search for a new support. And you have a video with like Dodo and Steve saying, actually, this old OPL MVP, Ayla, is our starting support, and we believe in it, and we'll find success. And then his very first game, he plays Thresh and makes this ridiculous lock-in highlight play where he lands multiple hooks and has the perfect lanterns, and then they start 3-1, and they have good team fighting, and he has good landing with Han Sama. People would legitimately kind of be freaking out, and they'd say, like, holy crap, this young talent Ayla is doing really well. But what ends up happening, and I'm not saying people have been dunking on Ayla and saying he's not good, but like the best you will hear of it is like, oh yeah, he did a good job filling in. Rather than saying like, no, he just did a damn good job. And that's kind of what I wanted to add to him. But something kind of to reflect on this a little bit, something that might have helped TL look better replacing Core JJ, who is an irreplaceable player, is the fact that it was kind of a new roster in the first place, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So Bwipo and Bjergsen and Santorin can still find their own style without Core JJ, because I can just think back to, you know, the 14 months that I was coaching TL, and Core JJ would have been like completely irreplaceable. There were definitely moments where he was driving so much for the team. But I think the fact that they almost started without him might have made it easier to look good without him, which will then, my like hot take actually is Core JJ isn't just going to come in and turn them into the Avengers. Like, they're going to have, I think, some issues making it all work now that this other really influential player has joined the squad. What do you think of that? Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I think so. We've only had like one game of footage, but the thing that most interested me, actually, despite the fact that it wasn't like perfect, was that their 2v2 laning was so aggressive. Like, it was actually so, like, you could argue maybe too aggressive, but like, I love watching bot lanes like that. So that made me really happy. And it was something that we kind of saw with people would always talk about, like, tacticals willingness to go in. And now that 2v2 bot lane fighting, like the initial level 1 to level 2 contest for the wave push is even more important now post TP changes. And the fact that people are just fighting 2v2 in the bot lane a lot more often makes me super excited to see how aggressive they will be, because bot lane is something that actually in the LCS is like pretty stacked across the board, like maybe unexpectedly so. Like, I feel like people went into the into LCS after this offseason, they were like, man, jungle is just
so like, good,
you know. It's really, really, really good. But I would encourage people to look at some of the bot lanes that they might not have thought of, because I think bot lane 2v2s have been really interesting thus far.
Here's a good transition. TL plays against EG on the first day.
Woo!
EG is 2-2, and you mentioned in the article, like, they were an incredibly hyped team, undefeated in lock-in all the way until the finals. But since then, they've gone 0-3 and have started 2-2. So where are you at on assessing EG after 2 weeks of LCS and a whole lock-in tournament?
So I still think EG are really good. I think it's going to be, it's another matter of framing, because they've had, and actually Immortals have had an identical schedule, and we'll talk about it again with Immortals, but like through week 3, when they play each other on day 2, I believe, they've had an exact identical schedule. And so it's interesting to me that it has been brought up with Immortals, where people are like, Immortals are better than you think because they're facing a ton of really tough teams right off the bat. Similarly to how people are like, well, FlyQuest are probably a little worse than you think, because not only did they run the Smite top strategy, the Smite support top strategy, but then they also are facing the weaker teams in the league. But with EG, no one has mentioned their strength of schedule, which has been, it's been pretty strong. So I still think that EG are a very strong team. I definitely don't think that they are, you know, the best team. Like, I think right now the best performing teams are TL and C9. And they're slightly below that. And actually talking to Vulcan off camera, he said something similar, where it's like, we're still really good, but these two teams are performing better.
Did he mention 100 Thieves at all? Or is that probably, I
forget,
like,
honestly,
where
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. It's fine. It's fine if not, because it's an interesting point of like where their ceiling may or may not be, because there is so much hype and expectation that Danny and JoJo are going to continue ascending, and like surely the ceiling of this team is going to be. Would you still agree that like the ceiling of this team could be first?
Yes, and I also like calling out JoJo specifically, just because I think he's a really easy bridge to talk about, like, and I'm not going to get too far into this because this is like a whole other conversation.
Whole other episode.
He's a very, yeah, exactly. I could talk about this for a while. He's a very easy bridge to talk about League of Legends in North America as a whole, and like who is coming up the pipeline. And like, if you are a young kid who is playing League of Legends, you're not actually likely to play League of Legends. Like, if you have really strong, talented hands, you're going to be playing something on a console probably. And the fact that he ended up choosing League of Legends as a profession is something that will forever be very interesting to me, because most people don't, right? Because of a whole bunch of factors, easy access, the fact that US is, has all of these socioeconomic factors involved, the fact that we're just like massively a console country instead of a PC country, just a ton of stuff that I don't have time to get into. But I like calling out JoJo for that reason, because I do think he's incredibly mechanically talented. Yeah. Even with that last pick, Akali, that I personally did not like in draft, and I know we talked about it together on and off the desk. I think that, he was still having some like really insane mechanical moments in team fights. I think you see similar from Danny, who's another person who just chose to play League of Legends when he has the hands to play other stuff. So that to me automatically makes this like a super interesting team. And that's without even mentioning like Inspired and Vulcan and how good they are, and obviously Impact. So, I mean, I still love the dynamic of this team. I still think they're going to be a really formidable and interesting team. But I wanted to talk about the framing and expectations, because I do think it's funny how like weirdly low people are on them now.
Right. It's almost overcorrected, you think? Because it was, I thought it was way too high. Personally, like I know you don't do power rankings anymore. You've like banned power rankings.
Put it in the contract. You know? No, I'm just kidding. I don't actually have that in my contract, but I should have.
Yeah, I think I put them, shoot, I want to make sure I get this right. I think I put them third in my preseason power rankings. That was like right after they just lost the finals, and it was like a hot take that 100 Thieves would be above them. But now it's almost like people are looking at them as like a fifth-ish, sixth. Like they're technically in sixth in the LCS right now. Where my eyes are going to be drawn, and I'm like, fingers crossed that this becomes true. Not because I hate EG, but because I think it's an epic matchup. I hope they lose to TL to be 2-3. I hope Immortals beats TSM to be 2-3, and we get the Zoomers versus Boomers game to decide who gets to be 3-3 and who gets to be 2-4 between Immortals and EG on day 2. Because I asked for this to be in broadcast, but I want to bring it up on the podcast first. The combined age of JoJo and Danny, the mid and 80 carry, is 35. The combined age of Power of Evil and Wild Turtle is 15 years more. It's 50. They're 24 and 26. It is the biggest disparity of your like backline damage that we have in the LCS. And I just want to see that battle each other, because everyone will have their opinion of like, those are the roles that like shouldn't be old, so to speak. But if Immortals beats them, I think that would be like a victory for the more experienced guys.
Do you want a fun anecdote? I remember when people were going on Weibo and comparing the ages of all of the LPL teams, and then they'd be like, "Oh no, our 80 carry is 19. We need to find a new one. Like they're already too old." And I remember reading this and being like, "Holy crap."
19 they were saying is too old.
I think it was like half a joke, but that is actually what people were doing, is like comparing the ages of so.
Wow.
When you have so much talent coming up.
I mean, it's true. It's true. It's like you've already seen the 17-year-olds for 2 years. You haven't seen the new 17-year-old at all. Maybe he's better. What's in the mystery box? It could be another mystery box. Okay. Let's talk about Golden Guardians. I liked your stat. I actually found exactly the same stats, so I'm glad you put it in here. Who holds the largest average goal lead in the LCS at 15 minutes? Were you surprised?
It can't be a surprise, because Golden Guardians have to be in the header, but because that's the way we write 10 thoughts. But I was surprised a little bit, only because I was shaky on. I knew they had a really strong early gold going into last week, but then I was not sure how the 2 games they had affected that, especially the TSM one where there was just, that absolutely disastrous level 1 where Spica just got so far ahead of Pride Stalker until they then botched their bot lane push. I wasn't sure how that would factor in, like how big of a deficit that was, but they're still in first, so they're still chugging along, and they have the strongest average gold lead at 15 minutes of any LCS team, and Dignitas are second to that, actually, to back up something we were talking about earlier. But yeah, like, this team is really good at getting early advantages. They're actually pretty smart about it, and then their mid to late game is highly questionable. Let's just say, I know that some people are calling it like the worst game ever, like, oh my god, what did my eyes see? I actually argued with Mark about this,
which is
previously.
TSM Golden Guardians. But
I actually thought Golden Guardians' response to TSM was really smart at times. Obviously not contesting the level 1. That was not advised into the rel. They should have just split map. But the way that they decided to swap Aphelios top, and the way that they kind of sussed out how they wanted to play against a Smite support top, showed that they had thought about what happened when they previously faced this strategy and actually almost beat it, like narrowly lost through contesting it, and also some of FlyQuest's mistakes in execution. So and that's like what I want to see, right? Like sure, you can go through that game and you can point out so many mistakes, right? Like there are so many mistakes in that game that both teams make. It's insane. However, when you have so many teams playing so many different strategies, I get really excited when I see something like this, because I'm like, okay, that shows me that even if you're not executing on this like to the best of your ability, there's obviously thought behind, if we see this again, what are we going to do with it? And how do we use our strengths? Like, for example, how well Pride Stalker can play Zed and how well he performs on that pick. Like, how do we use our strengths and then execute on countering this? And I saw that in that game, so I really wanted to call it out because I think it's really easy to focus on all of the execution errors, of which there were many in that game, again, by both teams. But it's not as easy to showcase some of the bright spots in a game like that, especially when they go so long. So I want to call it out.
Yeah, and I also want to call out, if you watch the episode with Spawn, he did this as well, but like the Golden Guardians coaching staff is possibly the most robust coaching staff that exists in the LCS. They have like multiple coaches who are challenger players still. Like I know Choo Choo's one of their assistant coaches for mid, and Spook's their assistant coach for jungle, as well as Stixay their assistant coach for AD carry. Like those are really, really high level solo queue players, and it does.
Is still playing in academy.
Yeah,
he's been subbing for Violet this entire time.
Yeah, it makes me actually a little more bold on their ability to take games off of higher level teams. I will caveat a little bit, their gold lead might have to do with the fact that they played against Smite top twice. It definitely contributes to them having the most turret plate takes of any team because it ends up in map split. But it's still up to interpretation on whether or not the Smite strategy is like bad early game or contributes to being good early game. But generally, if you have someone like not up top and the other top laner is going to like farm plates and gold early, maybe that helps them. But it'll balance out as we continue the season, and it's definitely a really good stat to track. But you called me out in your article about Immortals, where you say somewhere in the empty analyst desk, Jat's talking about how they're not the worst team.
I really just wanted to bring up how, like, I wonder if people see us on the analyst desk like we're not real people and we just never leave the analyst desk, just like you never thought your teachers left school. Because you've been saying this since lock in, right? The
Yeah.
Immortals are not the worst team. Please stop calling them the worst team. And I think the visible weight I could see like lift off of the players' shoulders when they got their first win was just very nice to see, because there is no reason for a team with this amount of like experience and talent on it to be performing as poorly as they were. And they had, as we've brought up on the desk, but I reiterate in this article, they, along with EG, have had the toughest strength of schedule, because they've had the same schedule and then they play each other. So um, it's something that's worth calling out, right? Because again, in a league where you have so many teams trying so many different strategies, and then on top of that, you have to face the top teams who are all trying out these strategies. That's a really tough ask. And the criticism I'd levy at this team is that I haven't seen much of their own strategy, or what I think there would be their strategy, outside of like scaling for late game team fights.
That might be it. That might be the strategy. But yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And I want to add that it was weird to me in lock-in how their decision making seemed so bad. Because if a team with this much experience had consistently bad decision making, that's when I get really worried. But it has improved a little bit in recent weeks. I want to maybe combine the CLG and TSM conversations a little bit, but we will start with CLG because in Lock-in Tournament, I think there was definitely this sense of optimism when they had some nice, impressive wins through Palafox's Twisted Fate, which you mentioned in the article. And then they even took a game off of Cloud9 in the bracket stage. But since then, it's been rough. What do you think is going on with them?
So when and this isn't like one-to-one comparison, because all of these players have had some sort of LCS experience outside of Luger. I believe he's the only one.
Correct. Poom got a few games with 100 Thieves.
LCS experience.
Contracts even went to Worlds with Cloud9 back in like 2016. Palafox, FlyQuest, Jenkins, TL.
So it's like a very weird group of players who have all had experience in other orgs, or like limited LCS experience within another system, and then are now all on the same team. And again, like we saw glimpses of understanding of like, we have this composition, this is how we need to play it out. I think you could even see that in that Diana Yasuo comp that they had, despite the fact that it got messed up really early and they had to adjust quickly with it. It's sad to see them be so directionless, and I don't know if it's just because, again, there are all of these other players coming from different systems that had really strong voices on their teams and really strong staff behind them. You know, if we think about like the 100 Thieves system, the EG system, and then previously C9, the TL system, I already talked about how Jenkins was really set up well by that, in my opinion. And I look at these players and I just feel like the team is very directionless right now. And additionally, like, Contracts is someone that I really just wanted to see succeed because I've been watching him for so long. I was like one of his first ever LCS interviews when he stepped onto C9 as their starter. He's someone that I've always wanted to see well. Seeing him come back to the LCS last year with EG and splitting time was amazing. It's obviously like a very emotional moment for him. And he just looks like he feels like he needs to force plays, or he's behind the play. He's not farming as efficiently as he needs to on some of these picks. And it's just really sad because it feels like, on top of, like, if there was one person who I think you wanted to look at and be like, okay, who is going to be like the main leader with the most experience on this team, I would have pointed to contracts. And I think he himself even said, like, this is what I want to do this season. This is where I want to improve. I really want to step up in a leadership role. And it hasn't worked out. So that it just makes me really sad,
Yeah.
you know, like, because I know what he's capable of as a player.
Yeah. I think they are either putting a ton of pressure on themselves or a lot of pressure is being put on them. And this might be a parallel across CLG and TSM. And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but there was that pause in one of the CLG games. And I know the player cam like full screened in on contracts. And it looked like he just looked kind of clammy, like there was this cold sweat. And just the look on his face to me looked like he was just really stressed and nervous in the moment. And that's not the look I want of like the leading jungler on the team. And that's me reading into like the body language because as you mentioned, the play has also looked pretty bad. But it like, listen, CLG was 9th or 10th in both splits of 2020. They were 9th or 10th in both splits of 2021. Across the last 2 years, they've been numerically the very worst team in the LCS. They fire sold basically everything, rebuilt all of this. And even though it can be a fresh start with a sense of optimism, like there's gotta be a lot of pressure to like not be the worst. So when they open up at 0-4, that's just like really tough to overcome. And I don't know like what the solution for that can be. It's almost like they just need a really strong like morale guy somewhere within the team or within the players. Cause, we'll get to TSM in a bit and have the conversation about what a development roster looks like. I had the belief last year that close to 5 teams in Academy could be competitive, if not better, than 5 of the teams in the LCS. I thought it was that big. Like I thought there was that much talent in Academy compared to what was in the LCS. And one of the examples of this was like when FlyQuest just like randomly subbed in 5 people and they went 3-0. And I think one of the actual like big differences in whether or not these players can succeed or fail is like how much support is offered to them both internally and externally. Because there's no way that these players are capable of actually filtering out Reddit and Twitter. It's just too big a part of everyone's life. And I felt like there was such low expectations for the FlyQuest Academy guys when they came in, they could come in with no pressure. But for this CLG team, it's like everyone has been saying that this is the CLG rebuild and that they're going to do really well. And as soon as they fall short of those expectations, it like crushes them. That's just an observation. I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
Well, I was going to say it almost like in that regard, it's almost bad that they did have so many like flashes of brilliance in the first part of lock-in, right? Because then people did start talking about having like higher expectations for them than people initially thought, which is where in a lot of preseason rankings, I saw them down towards the bottom based on the lineup. But another really interesting thing to talk about when like, just because we're going to make the transition into talking about like talent development and what is a development roster, you then have to look at this team and be like, how much time are we going to give them? Because I saw their problems as like different than TSM, and my hot take was that I felt worse watching CLG than I did TSM, because at least TSM had people like going in and trying to make like decisive plays, and then it was just miscoordinating them. Whereas CLG over their past week just looked like they lacked like any sort of direction. Which was kind of sad to see. I also do want to call out that their academy team is like doing super, super well actually right now.
True.
So they're like one of the best looking academy teams right now.
Okay, let's transition to TSM because there's some breaking news on this actually. I just want to update people on what the meltdown that's happening on the TSM subreddit right now. So at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, they announced that player comfort and adaptation are core values at TSM. With this in mind, we've decided to substitute Yursan with Shenyi for the upcoming LCS Academy games. As a recent arrival, Shenyi requires more time to adjust to NA. He will benefit from the Academy League's environment whilst accumulating more game time at a more comfortable pace. So I read this. I personally think it's like it's just an announcement. They're subbing him out, but they're trying to give a reason because they don't want to say what the real reason is. But then they follow up with it. Their new VP Esports mentions in, I believe, a Discord, Shenya needs more time to adjust to NA and improve within the TSM team environment. We feel that him working with the Academy team will help him adjust and settle. This will smooth out some chemistry issues, taking off some pressure from the current communication structure. To clarify, for the time being, Shenya will be playing with our Academy roster, and your son will be playing with our LCS roster. And Academy rosters were locked today, so they had to make a public statement, and that they'll do a better job communicating going forward. Then, the part that I think is causing the meltdown is like Shenya streamed and then someone translated it. So bear with me, take this with like a grain of salt. I don't know if the translation is completely accurate. I couldn't translate it myself, but they said from Shenya's stream before the I'm sorry tweet, he said that NA has too little practice compared to LDL and LPL. Challenger queue wait queue is too long, and support is not really a role in solo queue. I will add that this is correct. The support is one of the hardest roles to get games for in Champions queue, because for whatever reason, all the supports want to play it and the other roles don't as much. Never in his career has he went on a 4-game losing streak. When the team is winning, too many people talk in the comms, and when the team is losing, no one talks. From experience, that is a problem that a lot of teams have. He went to shot call this weekend, and it will look different, or he wants to shot call this weekend, and it will look different. And shot calling is his strength, but others didn't seem to trust him. NAC support role different from how LDL/LPL sees it. So that's the news catch up. But Emily, what are your thoughts so far on what's going on?
So I'll provide some context in terms of, I guess, what I think a lot of LPL teams see their supports as, just because it's something that's come up when we've talked about support champion pools, where it's not that someone like Mako, for example, who's one of the best supports in the world, it's not that he can't play Enchanters. If anything, EDG are a team that will be much more willing to play Enchanters because of the way they play around bot lane. But traditionally, the role of a support for a lot of LPL teams is always like the primary initiator and the initial go button. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's not even communicated. It's just the expectation that if someone is going in, the rest of the team is going to be following up, because it's always better because as soon as you go in, right? If that person goes in alone, it's a losing play. If the rest of you follow, it still might be a losing play. It might be a worse losing play, but there's a lot more chance of it to be a positive play, actually.
Yeah.
And I know this is something that coaches discuss around their teams when you're trying to like bring a team back from being a little too aggressive, where you're trying to teach them how to choose maybe better engages together. Mm-hmm. But the consensus is that it's always better to go in, and often, LPL teams will just not even if the rest of the world is playing more Enchanter supports, they're playing more like straight up 2v2 bot lane fights with mages. LPL supports, I remember for the first, I think it was 2 weeks, I was looking on Gold GG and noticing that, the LCK support pool had, Yumi at the top and, a few other enchanters, and then LPL, this isn't true anymore, but just for the first few weeks, it was, or first week, it was, LPL was still, Thresh, Leona,
right,
Nautilus, they're never changing, because they see the support role as someone who is a primary initiator. And we saw this last year with TSM with Sword Art, where he would go in, he would be ahead of the play, or ahead of where his team was, and the team would not follow up, and it would end up looking really bad for him, because it just looks like he's out there on an island. We saw the same thing with Shenya this past week when he was playing with TSM. He'd go in, there's a fundamental misunderstanding because the rest of the team is definitely not going in, or they did not get the message that they're going in, and it works, and it ends up looking really, really visually bad, right? Those are the plays where you anyone who's watching can look at any level of League of Legends that they play. They don't even have to play League of Legends. They can look at that play.
That's not good.
That is not a good play. Yeah. So, I mean, the big thing here is how much time is like too little or too much, right?
Exactly. That's the big question. And I think it's because it's also been heavily positioned as a development roster. It'll be a question that I think applies to both CLG and TSM because both of them have said they're building for the long term. TSM is even more arguably like it's going to take longer because the players are even younger and have even less experience. So, I guess first question, from what we've seen, which is only 4 games and 2 weeks of play, and what you know and have seen from your son, does this make sense to try something new?
Not unless it's like there's a massive communication issue internally that they feel like they can't fix. Because, like, it doesn't make sense, especially since this team didn't get a lot of practice prior to, like, they didn't get a lot of practice together prior to their LCS debut. They did not get the same ramp up time in lock-in that I think I pointed out. Both TSM and C9 actually is two teams that really could have benefited from that ramp up time because lock-in isn't the regular season.
Yeah.
So it's a chance where you can try out stuff, and if you are a new team and you're working through a lot of language and cultural barriers, that it can help a great deal. Like, even if you're not, for example, we saw C9 last year improve visibly from their first game in lock-in to making the finals, right? And even though they lost, like, you could visibly see like lock-in helped that team out a lot. I think this roster needed more time. I think if you're going to have a development roster, you do need to give them more time. But
Yep.
TSM historically has not been an organization who is allowed for losses.
True.
And so it doesn't surprise me that they're making this move despite saying that this is a development lineup.
I guess that's true in the fact that it's actually not surprising, but it doesn't match up with what we've seen and what we've heard of a development roster for them. I will devil's advocate a little at first. We have only seen 4 games. TSM has seen probably closer to 100. If they were scrimming during lock-in, assuming they can do 5 scrims a day, 5 days a week, that's at least 50. And then the last 2 weeks have been another 40 scrims per week, at least if they're not doing night blocks. So they would have way more data than just 4 games. But to not devil's advocate, and now to kind of give my opinion, this is just too fast. Like, if you trusted your scouting on this guy, you got to give him more than 2 weeks before you try something else. Even from just a confidence mental issue. Like, even if you think, like, hell, if you need to give him more rep shot calling, let him play Academy and LCS, right? Just let him have more stage games. So I feel like it is the pressures of the organization's expectations influencing the team decision to a greater extent than I think it should.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if communication has broken down internally, that it's just like that, you know, that bad of an atmosphere that they had to move him. Like, I don't know, but I do know that I'm now curious to see how well he'll do in Academy based on the fact that you would think that even with Peter there, he's probably not going to get the same amount of like infrastructure help. Like, moving to the US from China is a really massive cultural shift, and not everyone deals with it well. Like, I think I will say with Kaido, at the very least, he seems to have like a very strong and outgoing personality where he, just watching his stream, he seems like someone who would maybe be able to acclimate a little bit better. And again, I'm making a lot of assumptions there, but like someone who is a lot more outgoing and just a very like friendly person, and more importantly, someone who's willing to make mistakes and make a lot of mistakes when they're speaking a language that they're not familiar with. Like, it's actually one of the reasons why I don't always improve in languages as quickly as I could, is because I get really afraid to speak it because I'm never going to be perfect, and that always enters my head. That's actually will adversely affect your language proficiency significantly if you're trying to learn a new language, if you're not just willing to like throw it out there and be wrong. And he seems to have that like a good attitude about that from what I've seen. So
Right.
I did want to call that out. But yeah, I mean, it just overall makes me really sad. Like, I always dislike when things don't work out. Like, ideally, I would want to see all 10 LCS teams always playing at their best, and then all we have to talk about is, you know, like who is better than who and who is like executing better than who, right?
Right.
That's never going to happen because players are people. And I guess like I would like people, as a final capper, I would like people to remember that. Like,
That's hugely important, especially for the teams and the players that are at 0-4. I know, even though it's a very interesting conversation, it's like a conversation that I want to have. Like, even us talking in extents about a 0-4 TSM and what may or may not be wrong within the team has a way of adding pressure to the team and making it worse. Like, none of this actually helps them. So it is so hard for a team to pull themselves out of the bottom like that. But we kind of have to talk about it. It's the industry that we live in, so we got to do it as kind of respectfully and as logically as we can. I guess the final question I'd have on, like, we didn't answer the question, like, to you, what is a development roster? Like, if you're just thinking of a development roster, what level of failure could or should prompt experimentation and change?
so I think it depends on what you're seeing as failure. So like if like let's say to return to CLG, right? Like let's say internally that CLG have some sort of internal metric where they feel like they are improving, like their individual players are improving. I think this would have been maybe a lot easier to say at the end of lock-in, right? Like, so say at the end of lock-in, they're like, hey, you know, we didn't beat C9, but look at all this good stuff that we learned. Like, and I think that's like a very good way of looking at development roster, because if you are developing, you are not expected to be the best. You are looking at improve, like typically taking pretty young players or like relatively inexperienced players and making them better as a 5-man unit and then also as individual players. And so then internally you set your own metrics and goals by like, last week we sucked at this, but you know what? This week we actually like shored this up here, and here, right? Like, and that is really good. So now we can take that information and use it to, you know, leverage that against some of our other opportunity areas here now that we have that down. And we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about this. I think that is, in my opinion, the most like constructive way to look at a development roster and try to set those expectations. I actually think a team that was pretty good at this was last year's Golden Guardians, even with the roster change they made, where they were really upfront from the get-go about like, you know, our parent org didn't give us a lot of money. This is the roster we have. We fully believe in our coaching staff. We think we're better than people say we are. And I think based on the metrics that they set for themselves in terms of developing the talent they had, like Iconic was a much better player at the end of last year than at the beginning. Chime was a much better player at the end of last year than the beginning, you know, and they ended up surprising some people.
And they kept Blaze all over across years. So they got Licorice. So they got two pieces of their upcoming split. And to add to that, they were 3-15 in spring, which is awful. And I think there's many, many people that would have said, like, get rid of Niles after like 10 games because he was performing atrociously. But they tried it for a much longer time than is normal in esports. then they did find what ended up being a better solution in Licorice, and they went 11-17 in the summer. My take on this is the time horizons right now is just laughably fast. Like, you can't develop in a month.
Nope.
It's like absolutely ridiculous, that expectation. So are you familiar with the process and the 76ers?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is a favorite one.
As a meme and in all seriousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever read like Sam Hinkie's, like, I called it the like NBA version of the Dunzo Manifesto? Okay, you're actually super familiar on this, but I want to tell the viewers anyway, and you can add in the things that I've missed. Like, the 76ers were like the most extreme development roster ever. But their biggest thing was like accumulating assets in a unique way, but also they were just so awful. Like, they set NBA losing streak records. They no one came to their games. It's like a 20,000 person stadium, like 5,000 people showed up. But at the start of it, this guy called Sam Hinkie, who was their GM, he might have been the president of basketball operations, but he was like, no, this is going to be like a 5-year tank. Like, we're going to suck for 5 years, but then we can actually win a championship. We're never going to win a championship if we are average for 5 years. We'll never have a way of breaking through. And he actually ended up getting fired, like, before his plan could come to fruition. All he did is acquire assets. And they're like, we've got enough assets. Like, start winning. And he was like, I told you at the start what the plan was. And they're like, all right, we're going to bring in Brian Colangelo. So they just fired him. And then they actually ended up being pretty good. They got a bunch of assets. You can argue about whether or not they managed them. But they're actually a really good team now. They're like one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. Anyway, the tangent there is like, that's the extreme example in pro sports. I think the less extreme example in pro sports that's become pretty acceptable now is like 1 or 2 years of sucking. Like, that's 1 or 2 years. And there's a draft, like there's draft assets that you're basically tanking for, but there's also a feeling of like, let's give these other guys meaningful reps to win. And they set the expectation that like, this team is not going to make the playoffs. And if they make the playoffs, it's a bonus. I think the problem that happens in LCS is the team isn't willing to admit the consequences of what development means. I look at this LCS season now, Emily, and I know that 100 Thieves, Cloud9, Team Liquid, EG are all in win now mode. That's already the top half of the league. So the instant you say development, the best you should hope for is 6th. But like, Immortals is also not developing. Golden Guardians also just brought in more veterans with Ole. They're not developing. So now your development roster, I think, is like, the more I think about it, 8th, 9th, or 10th. That's actually the crew you're playing in. And beating those teams means you're developing better than the other 3. And like, the expectations are just so low. So the fact that it almost feels like it's inconsistent after 2 weeks with that framing would be like ridiculously short time horizon for me. But that's, again, a lot of assumptions, and who knows if there's something that happened internally, in which case this would be a wash.
It's also, it's really funny because everything in esports moves so much more quickly than traditional sports, which is another reason why I think we have a lot of over or under reactions, I guess, is how I'd say it. But like, your team loses like one game and suddenly everyone is like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
And this isn't a new thing. It's happened since I started watching LCS and or when it started. I was going to say back in 2012, but those were tournaments.
Yeah.
So yeah, like, I think it's another interesting nod to how quickly things move in esports and how little time players are given a lot of the time.
Yeah. Part of it is the split is literally 2 months long. Like if you don't do well in 2 months, okay, you've just lost spring. And that's like a benchmark that maybe the team has set. So the format definitely doesn't do development any favors, but it's something you need to consider going in. Do you have anything? We've gone on for about an hour 10. Do you have anything else you wanted to add on this before we wrap up?
No, that's it.
Well, thank you for joining me, Emily. That was really fun.
No, it was fun.
Yeah,
I could talk about talent development for a while.
Yeah, I kind of think maybe this could have easily been a breakout episode, but it was topical, and I'm sure we'll have more refined takes as things go on and the story continues to develop. All right, 10 Thoughts with Emily Rand, lolesports.com or her League of Emily Twitter. I'm sure she's going to retweet it or do something to help promote. Thanks for joining me once again, and I'll see everybody next time.